Denise.
Denise, good to meet you.
Hey, Isabelle, I'm Christina Pack.
Am I going to hand it to Denise?
Right. Welcome. Wait, what am I doing? Introducing. I'm
This is the
introducing.
one for the live.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good idea.
Because we don't like tape it to the person, then we're not going to hear the question.
Yeah, got you.
So, and if we do mess up on that, what you might want to do is repeat the question.
Oh, yeah.
So they'll have the normal mic and I'll have this stuff?
Like, you remember when we were at the church and I didn't repeat the question?
Okay.
So you don't do that.
All right, you ready?
Yes, sir.
No, and then she'll be moving.
Yes, I move about. Yes.
So she will not, Isabella will not need that kind of.
Oh,
Oh, we're going to wait 2 minutes.
Okay,
There's
great.
still people coming in.
All right.
You're very welcome. We're going to wait 2 minutes.
No, thank you. I'm so
I
honored
was
to
telling
speak.
her what to do.
So happy to have you. I've been telling my students all about you.
Oh, thank you.
The audience. Well, I'll tell you what, just give it to me and I'll give it to them. Is that okay? Or would you rather, or would it be just simpler to leave it there? Maybe it's just simpler to leave it there. And you can just do it. Let's just sort of get to the Q&A part. Yeah, that's fine.
All right.
Before we get started, I will ask everybody, turn their phones to silent mode, please.
That's not your sister.
Where are you a student?
I'm at Davidson.
Oh, you're Davidson?
Yes.
Okay.
And I'll say that too. so
Okay.
in case
Well, I'm not
you
gonna
don't
say
have to worry. Oh, those are some cute shoes. I didn't see those.
Thank you. I'm hoping it doesn't rain too hard. Gotta protect him.
That's not very good for a print journalism teacher. This is a good crowd. It's going to get warm in here. All right, 1 more minute, then I'll start. Ready?
Very close enough. By the way, News Channel 6 is supposed to be sending someone and they want to interview you.
Who? Her. Not me, her.
Oh, well, yeah, you too. Because you're the department chair. Of course, her.
But no, her. I'm just.
Of course.
She's done several of those.
I'm just a tall white male here.
Yeah.
All right, ready up? Okay. All right, good evening, everybody. Good evening, everybody. There you go. All right. Now we got some church thing going on. I'm David Bulla. I'm a journalism historian, and I am the interim chair of the Department of Communication here at Augusta University. I'd like to welcome all of you to this evening's talk by Isabelle Schwartz. And I'm not going to talk too long because we want her to be the main person tonight. The Department of Communications here at AU is honored to have her speak here on the Somerville campus on this very, very important topic. First, I want to say that I am a member of a steering committee of an international conference on slavery that we've been holding for about 5 years, mainly in Europe. And I can tell you that sex trafficking is a major problem around the world today, as literally millions of human beings are part of a global supply chain. And I hate to put it that way, but that really is what it is. Each year, I hear fellow scholars give research papers on the devastating effects of the sex trafficking industry, which is what it is, particularly in Europe. Yet the problem is not limited to that continent. It occurs everywhere in the world. For the purpose of orienting us to this topic, I want to give the definition of sex trafficking from the U.S. government. Quote, the U.S. Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act defines sex trafficking as the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of an individual who under force, fraud, or coercion is induced to perform a commercial sexual act, unquote. And that's as far as I'm going to go on the topic. I'm going to let Isabelle be the person who, this is her passion, so we're going to let her speak. However, I do want to recognize a few people tonight before she gets started. First, I want to thank Darla Linville, Marianne Cook, and Stacy Hudson of the College of Education. I don't know if they're here or not, but if they are, maybe we ought to have them stand up. Go ahead. At least one of you are here. Okay. All right. Thank you. I also want to thank Leanna Babanya from the English and Foreign Languages Department in the Pamplin College. Is she here? She's not here. Okay. And then finally, Laura Graves. Laura, stand up, from the Department of Communication. And Laura was the one who really put this show together tonight, so we're very appreciative of her and all of her students who've shown up tonight, and all the other students for coming out. So now I want to turn it over to Denise Lennar Solomon from Education, and she's going to introduce Isabelle, and I'm going to sit down and shut up. Thank you. Hand off the microphone. There you go.
Okay, hi. Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here tonight. I'm so proud. As was stated before, my name is Denise Lennar Solomon. I'm an assistant professor in the College of Education. And I'm originally from Belize, Central America. So I focused a lot there because of the situation in the Belize on gender-based violence, specifically human trafficking. It was in one of my classes, in my ethics class, that I met someone, Martha Ann, where are you? And she shared with me that she had a daughter who knew or was involved in advocating on human trafficking. I taught her mother, and her mother said that when she was 13 years old, she came across a book at a local bookstore that told the story of a young girl caught in sex trafficking. She felt compelled to learn more and soon realized no one is immune from trafficking, and that having a smartphone puts a child on traffickers' radar in ways very few parents realize. Hearing this, I jumped at the chance to involve Isabelle and her mom in my crusade against commercial sexual exploitation of children. In fact, our first conference was in this building in 2017 at the Impacting Student Learning Conference that the College of Ed has every year. And that was her first presentation, and she hasn't stopped since then. She has made it her mission to raise awareness on this issue, and in the last 3 years, she has spoken to thousands at national academic conferences, medical and graduate school classes, youth groups, government organization, and regional church groups. Last May, she was one of 30 teen girls in the world selected for her LEAD fellowship for girls on their way to changing the world. She has just been notified that she is one of only 4 young women chosen as her LEAD ambassador. So you went from being like a participant to now you're an ambassador. Great. In this role, she will return to New York in December to receive customized training in leadership from advocacy and public service. Isabelle has recently been awarded a global grant to further her mission, and she's also working with the state education and elected officials to have sex trafficking curriculum, including in Georgia's middle and high schools. She's doing all this while currently being enrolled as a senior at Davidson Fine Arts School. For me, too often, the younger generations has chosen to ignore the many injustices in our community. Isabelle, however, has chosen to take a stand and has been able to successfully balance her role as an advocate while excelling academically. She has used her intellect and dedication to not only improve her own life and future, but those of others. Through her tireless work, she has been able to reach and assist those who are unable to advocate for themselves. So tonight, I am proud to introduce to you Miss Isabelle Schwartz.
Thank you so much for being here tonight. I know it is less than pleasant weather, so it was no easy trek. And I want to thank everyone who put this event together. Dr. Graves, thank you so much. This could not have been done without you. She worked very hard to coordinate all of our schedules and arrange this. Obviously, my mentor, Dr. Denise Lenara Solomon, you introduced me to this presentation world and letting me use the voice my mother taught me to have to a grander scale and to audiences like you tonight. So thank you so much. You've heard a lot about me so far, and I want to just give you a little bit more. I'm Isabelle Schwartz, you already know that. I just turned 18 years old. I go to Davidson Fine Arts School. I'm a vegetarian, and I cannot parallel park. But that's not what I'm here to talk to you about tonight. Tonight I'm going to talk to you about sex trafficking. So I want to start just with a little introductory video to get you understanding and in the mindset of what this really is. You've heard some definitions, but what does it look like? I think I have to go over here to play it. So this is a trailer from a documentary that came out a couple of years ago called I Am Jane Doe. A lot of victims of sex trafficking, female victims particularly, they go by Jane Doe because they are so many times going nameless, being sold, and being represented in the legal system. So that is why it's called I Am Jane Doe.
This is the United States. There's no possible way this is true.
I sent her out with one of her friends, and she didn't come back. Next thing you know, boom. He brought her into a life of hell.
It was like shopping on Amazon.
It's just a product.
The most popular internet site for escorts is called Backpage.com, where authorities say underage girls are sold for sex.
Backpage is the Walmart of human trafficking. It's an incredibly profitable business.
We will never be the family we were before she was sold on that website.
We need someone to give us a fighting chance.
What if it was your daughter? How would you feel then?
It's a very important case. Are these people wholesaling children in Washington State or not?
I'd like to meet a member of the judiciary or a member of Congress that thinks that status quo is satisfactory.
I'd like to call the CEO of Backpage, Carl Ferrer.
I've never seen anything like that.
What are they hiding?
This hearing is adjourned.
There is a question as to what kind of society we're going to be. Whether we're going to tolerate sexual trafficking in children. That is in front of everything that we believe.
I want my daughter to hold her head high and know that none of this was her fault.
I am Jane Doe.
I am Jane Doe. It's time for us all to stand up and be strong.
I am Jane Doe.
So you already got some broken down definitions earlier today in my introduction, but I want to just give you a little bit of a reminder, just in case it didn't sink in. This is very, very textbook definition. So sex trafficking, what is it? It is when a minor or an adult is forced to commit a commercial sex act. And a commercial sex act, breaking it down a little bit further, is when force, fraud, or coercion is used to make someone perform basically a normal sex act, except instead of it being a healthy relationship, a consensual relationship, they are doing so out of necessity for goods. So this can be in exchange for money, shelter, drugs, anything that that person needs. And a common misconception of sex trafficking is that the victims are benefiting. They are getting what is being traded. That is completely false. Anything that a victim gets the money, the food, the drugs, that is given to traffickers. So traffickers take the money, and then out of fear they will hold the victim hostage, or they will threaten to take their family. And we're going to get into that a little bit later, but just wanted to make sure that these basic definitions were down so you could have a deeper understanding about what really this is. So I'm going to start out very broad, and then I'm going to narrow down into Georgia and even Augusta. So internationally, human trafficking makes around $32 billion yearly. And human trafficking is not only sex trafficking. Human trafficking is labor trafficking and sex trafficking. Obviously today I'm here to talk to you about sex trafficking, which is 79% of all human trafficking on the globe. And every number you hear tonight, these are all conservative estimates because so much of this trade is underground and not traced. This is just what we have the evidence to back up. So every number you hear, it really is bigger in reality. This is just what we have on paper. So getting a little narrower, like we said, in the United States, there are around 100,000 to 300,000 prostituted children, even more are at risk. And these are anyone who are vulnerable. And we're going to get a little bit more into that later, but basically foster care, victims of sexual abuse, people who are lacking strong relationships in their lives, that is going to be used by traffickers to capitalize and to form relationships where they pretend to offer what this victim, what this trafficked individual is lacking, and then feign a secure attachment in order to later exploit and manipulate that victim for their own gain. So now we're going to get into Georgia. Atlanta has the largest sex economy in the United States, makes around $290 million every year alone from the sex trade. And one of the reasons that Atlanta is so profitable is its location. So first of all, it is by major interstates, major highways, has large sports stadiums. Sports events are huge pulls for the influx of victims and buyers as well as the traffickers, because the same market for sports events tends to be the same market for sex trafficking. So I'm going to get into that later, but basically sports events, obviously we have the Mercedes-Benz Stadium in Atlanta, and I'm going to talk about the Super Bowl. And then also with Atlanta, we have the huge airport. So this is buyers, traffickers, victims. They can be flown in and out. They can meet very easily. And that's because when you're buying a victim, you tend to go away from your home because you don't want to get caught. So you're going to move out of your home to a big city like Atlanta. In Georgia, it's estimated that 5,000 girls are at risk. And each month, a little under 13,000 men pay for sex with a young woman. Half of those are adolescent females. 100 juvenile girls are exploited nightly in Georgia. 65% of men buying sex in Georgia are doing so near Atlanta or in its suburbs. 9% near the international airport for the reasons we discussed. It's convenient travel, convenient means to transport or meet with a victim. And for some reason, we're not sure why, Atlanta has the largest number of Hispanic trafficked females. So in Georgia, 27.5% of all human trafficking is labor trafficking, while close to 73% is identified as sex trafficking. So sex trafficking is making up the vast majority of trafficking in the United States and in Georgia. And actually, sex trafficking is expected to surpass the drug trade in terms of profit, because drugs are non-renewable resources while humans are. If you are selling a drug, well, like any other product, you're going to take it, you're going to sell it, and then you have to get another product to sell. You can't resell that same drug. Instead, with humans, once you attach one person, once you have control over one person, you can sell them over and over and over again, and you're not losing profit because you're not having to supply yourself with a new victim. You can just exploit the same one. So in Georgia, in the United States, 56.8% of victims were native to the United States. A lot of times sex trafficking is put off as, well, these are the bad people bringing people in from other countries, and these are only immigrants, and we don't really need to worry about it because we were born and raised here, we know how to avoid it. There is some of that, but what we are seeing more and more is a rise of domestic victims. So you do not have to be a vulnerable immigrant to be exploited. You can be someone who was exploited in your own hometown and you knew your exploiter. Because like we said before, anyone is vulnerable, you just have different vulnerabilities. So 63.5% of Georgia victims were under the age of 23 while they were being exploited. And the largest concentration of victims being exploited were between the ages of 9 and 17. We're seeing ages represented across the board, like we said, 23 and older. I don't just talk about minor victims, that's what I focus on, however. But the largest concentration, the heaviest populated, were victims between the ages of 9 and 17. So within human trafficking, I want to talk about the process. How do you get trapped? How does it end up happening? So in sex trafficking, recruiters are broken down into two different personas, if you will. And that's illustrated right here in the corner. You see we have the finesse, or the Romeo pimp, and then we also have the gorilla pimp. So gorilla pimp is very much what we see in movies. This is brute force, physical abuse, that is their means of power. And that's what we're seeing when victims are kidnapped, they're taken from their homes, they're physically beaten, and that is how they are forced to commit sexual acts. But what is most common, and what is most common with social media, which is my focus, is the Romeo pimp. These are people who very much capitalize on idealizations of fairy tales, and they offer that. So when a victim is vulnerable, they feel insecure, all of a sudden these good-looking, in their 20s guys swoop in, and they offer the whirlwind romance. They offer, like it said, the Romeo persona. And this is when we see fake attachments form and fake senses of security, because all of a sudden this persona who is offering you strength and love and expensive gifts and everything you thought you needed, that turns into exploitation and debt that you can never pay off. So just a little bit more broken down. Force, fraud, and coercion, we talked about that a little earlier in how people are forced to commit sex acts. Force, these are the gorilla pimps. This is forced drug abuse, these are threats against you, threats against your family. Then we have fraud. This is most common what you see with victims who are coming from out of the country. They're being offered the American dream if they leave their home, come to the United States, and then of course they arrive here and they're being exploited in the sex trade. Coercion, this is also threats, because threats can be different ways, and this is very much mental manipulation. So I did this for you, you need to do this for me. Very commonly what we see with traffickers is they give expensive gifts, they lavish you with attention, and then once they decide that you are dependent on them enough, you have enough to repay them for, they will flip personas, and they'll say, okay, this is what I did for you, I just put food in your fridge, I did this, I took you to this place, I took you out for dinner, I bought you that expensive dress, it's time for you to start paying me back. And then they will convince them to sell themselves in the sex trade, or really give them no other option. So, a little more into this, what is so desirable about traffickers? They are offering what their victims want most. So this is broken down into protection, adventure, love, home, and opportunity. So adventure and opportunity go hand in hand. I often joke that a lot of times being from Augusta, you grow up hearing, oh, Disgusta, and you think, oh, I just can't wait to get out of here. You know, if I could go to New York, if I could go to LA, all of my problems would be solved. Traffickers know that. They know that you feel like that, and they're going to capitalize that. So they're going to offer you the trip to New York. They're going to offer you to live in LA because they know that you think that will solve your problems, and they're offering you the way out, and they know that then they will have something over you because they're the reason you're there. They're the reason you could get out. Protection, like we talked about before, victims tend to be vulnerable. So they could be sexually abused, they could be in foster care, or they could look like they're living the perfect life and feel isolated in school, isolated from their family. And so protection, these traffickers swoop in and they offer to be the provider, they offer to take them out of a dangerous situation. Home, they offer them the perfect home life. So these victims are often products of divorce, they have unstable home lives. And so similar to a Romeo pimp, a lot of times they capitalize on several of these, but Romeo pimps are especially going to offer the picture-perfect family. They're going to offer them the escape. They're going to offer them the alternate to reality until, of course, they decide that they've done enough and they can begin exploiting. So the 5 disguises traffickers use. Someone eventually broke this down into what's known as the 5 Ps, and traffickers use multiple of these depending on their approach to a particular victim. So a gorilla pimp, for example, could start as the punisher, and that is what he maintains the entire time, very much force, very much beatings. But with a Romeo pimp, he may begin as the pretender and the provider, where he's the perfect boyfriend and he gives you all these gifts, and then you know, 2 months after that routine, 2 months after they've secured you, they turn into the punisher. They turn into whatever is necessary to get you to perform how they would like you to perform. And this goes hand in hand with drug use. So a misconception about victims is they're druggies, they got themselves into it. Well, when victims are brought into the sex trade, it's very common for their traffickers to force them to use drugs. And the reason for that is they then are not only dependent on their trafficker, they are dependent on a substance that they would not have access to without their trafficker. So in a very rare case where a victim would find the means to leave her trafficker, his or her trafficker, if they somehow found themselves free of mental manipulation, free of any emotional ties, and said they wanted to leave, and they began stop performing, they refused to perform any commercial sex acts, if they could deal with that, deal with food being withdrawn, threats to their family, well then the trafficker would take away the drugs, and the victim would then go through withdrawal and do anything to get the drugs back. So it really is whatever thing you can hold over a victim, that is what traffickers are going to use. Whether it is manipulative, maybe whether it is mental, whether it is a physical substance, even if it's not just protecting themselves, but also protecting their families. So this is a video I play about pimps. This is Gunplay. I don't know if anyone's familiar with Gunplay. He is a rapper, and in this interview, he is in a podcast with 2 interviewers, and it's just a 2-minute clip. The whole thing is 45 minutes. I couldn't show it, but there is some very harsh language used. I would like to give you the opportunity to step out for a couple of minutes if you'd like to. Okay. All right. It's very, very crap.
How sweet is it a chance of it coming back?
People children,
Dude,
you know what I'm saying?
very, very.
Well, one time, you know what I'm saying? You know, in my pimp escapades, a bitch didn't want to go to work.
When you were pimping?
Pimping forever.
We gotta talk about it. Yes, this is.
I thought you was Great Savage.
I've been pimping, bro.
So the age of what?
My artist, PJK.
Yeah. Yeah.
Big time.
Wow.
Did 3 years for Panda.
Wow.
Right up in Vegas.
Man, hold on. Can we talk about this? When did you start pimping? This is.
I started pimping. Let me see when I started. Started pimping probably like 2003.
How do you convince a girl
2002
to sell pussy and give you all the money?
How do you not?
I'll tell you a lot of ways.
I understand. Look.
You pimp man is strong.
The fuck no, it ain't.
Listen, let me tell you something. Let me tell you something.
Give you all the money. That's crazy.
Listen, let me tell you something about women. Let me tell you something about women. Women, they need, especially ones that don't have the father figure in their life, don't have anybody to shield them, any comfort in their life. You come along and you give them that comfort. You fill that void. You don't have to ask for them.
In what way would you do that? In what way would you give them a comfort and filling you?
Playing the daddy role. Just being there for him.
Just giving a fuck.
Yeah.
That easy.
Yeah, it's that easy. You know what I'm saying? I don't want to get, the game is to be sold, not told. But I'm going to just give you, you know what I'm saying, a few, like a bitch down bad, you help a bitch get up on her feet. How much you make a week dancing? $2,000 a week. Give it to me.
So there are 2 things I want to talk about in that video. First of all, you saw his mindset, right? Gunplays. You saw how he very quickly recognized what made a victim vulnerable, and then offered to fill that void so that she would become dependent on him. So you heard him say, just play the daddy role. So basically the way traffickers are looking at this is, okay, what can I take advantage of so that this person believes me, trusts me, and then how can I use that to my advantage to exploit them? So the second thing I really like to talk about in this video, and the reason I play it so frequently, did you see the reaction of the interviewers when he revealed that he was a pimp? Because they did not know before the interview that he was a pimp. It was just supposed to talk about his rap career, because don't worry, he is still releasing music about being a pimp. They were pretty impressed. They were honestly a little awestruck when they realized that he was a pimp. Hopefully, if you and I were sitting in front of this man and he began talking about his pimp escapades, we would react not similar to these men when they said, oh, "You were a pimp? How did you do that? How did you convince a girl to do that? Man, I wish I..." It was like they were trading tips. So what I focus on in this video is not only the mindset of a trafficker, because we can all stand back and say, oh, that's sick, that's evil, I can't believe that they're taking advantage of people, but I also want you to look at how this is completely perpetrated by our culture where pimps are cool. Because they become a symbol for easy money, and they become a symbol of power instead of abuse. So when we see two in their 20s men using their platform, their podcast, their YouTube channel to show, look, we interviewed a pimp. Look, we hung out with this man. Look, we asked him how to be a pimp. And so it only further ingrains in our brains that there's nothing wrong with taking advantage of people. There's nothing wrong with sexually exploiting people as long as we are getting money from it, as long as it's building our career. And so I really talk about that, how it's not only the exploitation that is perpetrating sex trafficking, but it's also how we as a society have totally misinterpreted it. We've turned it into a power situation instead of an abusive situation. So I want to go back to Georgia just for a minute with some specific cases. A couple of years ago, the FBI did a nationwide sex trafficking bust, where it was in 2017, a couple of years ago, where 84 minor victims were recovered. 4 victims were rescued in Georgia, 3 in Atlanta, 1 in Augusta. The youngest victim rescued from this bust was 3 months old, who had been sold by a family friend. 120 traffickers were arrested nationwide, and half of those were located in Georgia. So the reason for this is traffickers' nets go far beyond where they are right at that moment. So when a victim of trafficking is rescued and discovered, they're taken as far away from their trafficker as possible, because likely they are not just operating in that town, that city, that state, they're all over the country. And so while 60, half of these traffickers were arrested in Georgia, that does not mean at any means that they were confined to Georgia. They likely were operating much larger beyond, because they had context and the net that allowed them to operate on that level. So Florida sex trafficking sting, this was this year, where a slew of spas in Florida were discovered to be connected, in the sense that workers at the spa were not actually consensually working. They were forced to stay overnight in the spa, and every client was actually somebody meeting them for a commercial sex act, and it was of course being led by an upper person. They were not selling themselves. So 5 spas were raided in total, and they were all proven to be connected with each other. And actually from this connection, there was an arrest warrant put out for Robert Kraft. Does that name sound familiar? Okay, well great. For the people who do not know, he is the owner of the Patriots football team. Yes, the Patriots football team, and he was proven to be connected with sex trafficking. So that brings me into the Super Bowl. I'm sure most of you know that this past Super Bowl was hosted in Atlanta. So we talked about how Atlanta has the largest sex economy in the United States. Well, the Super Bowl is the largest sex trafficked event in the United States. So when those two were put together, you can imagine that it was an insane influx of victims being moved in and out, so to meet the demand of buyers. So, along with Robert Kraft, who was later charged with connection to the Florida sex spas, we were able to arrest 169 traffickers and buyers in the Atlanta sex ring, because thankfully Atlanta law enforcement were prepared. Adult and minor victims were recovered, the youngest one being 14 years old. And actually the Georgia Cyber Center here in Augusta was used to help identify buyers and traffickers and make these arrests. So hopefully by this point we have all established that sex trafficking is a horrendous crime, just a total embarrassment to society and what we claim our values are. So why does it thrive? If we can all agree in this room that it is a terrible thing and it shouldn't continue, why does it continue? Well, I often compare the sex trade and the components of it to a product and a business. Like any other product, it's going to thrive if there's a demand for it. So traffickers are a huge perpetrator of this crime. But they didn't just decide to start selling children. There had to be a demand for it first. So the center of this cycle really is the buyers who are willing to pay for it. And traffickers are going to constantly change their products to what the buyers want. So traffickers, obviously these are the people who are physically exploiting and recruiting the victims. Buyers, these are the people willing to pay for it and deciding what they will and will not pay for. And victims, these are the girls and the boys who are forced to sell themselves or be sold by their traffickers, so to protect themselves, to protect their families, or anything they really care about. So how much can a pimp make? When I was first starting researching this topic and getting involved in what this looked like in my hometown, I was totally under the impression, as some of you may have been too, that, well, our Georgia gentleman would not pay for sex. No, this is a big city problem. This is an LA, New York problem. Atlanta pimps make 3 times on average what San Diego pimps make. So an Atlanta pimp averages weekly about $33,000 a week just from selling their victims, while San Diego pimp makes an average of $11,000 a week selling their victims. And a lot of times traffickers have more than one victim that they're selling. They have a little collection, if you will. So they have different products to offer different buyers. So, oh, you don't want a 14-year-old girl, well, I have a 9-year-old boy, or I have a 23-year-old woman. And so they kind of, like we do, collect different aspects, different things that we want to market for different reasons. So buyers. We've talked a lot about traffickers, and we're going to talk about victims, but I want to focus on buyers right now. 99% of all buyers are male, only 1% are female. And you've heard me talk a lot about female victims. You've heard me say she, her, girl victims. And I want to clarify very quickly, I'm going to get a little bit more into boy victims in a minute, but there are both boy and girl victims. I predominantly talk about female victims because there's more data available on that. These numbers are the same for female and male victims. It is not a shift when we're talking about boy victims. 99% of male buyers are the same for all victims. So when a boy is rescued from the sex trade or comes forward if he's able to escape, they are more reluctant to become public with it or agree to release information about it because they're dealing with double the stigma, essentially. Not only are they having to come forward as a victim of sexual abuse, as someone who is taken advantage of and exploited, they're also now being perceived as gay, and they are afraid of the consequences of that. So it's double the shame, really, because so much of traffickers' power is using shame to intimidate their victims and make them stay in the sex trade, and we're going to talk about that with social media. So 18.9% of buyers are in professions that involve working with children. 21.6% are positions of authority, so attorneys, law enforcement, ministers. And this is, I include this because a lot of times I'm asked, well, why isn't there stronger legislation? Why aren't there more proactive efforts to stop sex trafficking? And the very sad reality is because a lot of the people who are allowing the trade to continue are the same people who have the power to make those punishments harsher, make stronger legislation. So we're talking about lawyers, we're talking about business professionals, government officials, and they're either protecting themselves because they have a habit, or they're protecting someone who did them a favor, and it all becomes a cycle. So buyers tend to be, although this is not every buyer, the average is white, married, fathers with disposable income. And they range from 18 to 89 years old, but we're seeing an average age of 43. So the reason for this is, obviously, if you are penny pinching and you don't really have any money to spare, you're probably not going to spend that money paying for a victim. And this is similar to why sports events and sex trafficking have similar clientele. Because if you can afford to go to a sports event, if you can afford to travel to the Super Bowl, travel to the Masters, then you're probably also going to be able to afford a victim. And also, if you're far away from your family, most men attending the Super Bowl or the Masters do not bring their wives and children with them, well then, they're not there to correct you. They're not there to prevent you from buying your child. You're free. For that week, weekend, however long you're there, You don't have your wife bringing down your neck. You don't have your colleagues following up behind you. You don't have people there to check on you and know that you're not supposed to be with that victim. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the victims themselves. So in the United States, the average entry age of a victim is around 12 to 14 years old. That's the age they usually start in the sex trade. However, we're seeing that number rapidly turn lower and lower. So recent studies are showing that more and more the victims are ranging from 2 to 17 years old. And we talked about earlier a victim that was 3 months old. And so, like I talked about, I compare it to a product. You're going to alter your product depending on what people want. And people, unfortunately, are wanting younger and younger victims. And I talk a little bit about culture at the end of this, and I'm going to get into that a little later. But because people are willing to pay for 5-year-old, 4-year-old, 3-year-olds, then traffickers are going to meet that demand by recruiting 5-year-old, 4-year-old, 3-year-olds. Because they're there to make money, and they're not going to make money if they don't have a buyer's warrant. So, boy victims, specifically. We've talked a lot about girl victims. We are seeing a rise in boy victims. So from 2015, we're seeing around 5% of all victims rescued representing boy victims. And when I say boy, I mean adolescent men. They're not full-grown men. But now in 2018, which is the most recent study I could find, we're seeing 14% of all victims trafficked were boy victims. And so we're seeing not only a rise in data on these boys, but also a rise in them willing to come forward. So child victims are sold usually around 10 to 15 buyers a night. So what we're seeing very common is victims are given quotas, whether they arrange it themselves or their traffickers arrange it for them. They have to meet with a certain number of buyers or make a certain amount of money before they are given necessities. So if they do not make $1,200 in a night, or they do not meet with 10 buyers a night, then they're not given food, they're refused shelter, they're refused drugs, or they're risking harm coming to their immediate family. So a lot of times what we see traffickers use to hold victims in the trade is, well, if you don't do this, if you don't make that, then I'll go and get your younger sister. Or I know how your dad gets to work. Or I know how your pastor goes home. And it's people that this victim clearly cares about, that they're trying to protect, and have to meet these demands, whether to get food for themselves or to keep harm away from their family. So victims can be exploited a wide range, and these of course have altered with the times. So prostitution, erotic massage, stripping, private parties, escorts, pornography, this can all classify as exploitation. And I want to talk a little bit about pornography for a minute. Obviously pornography has surged in its prevalence in our culture recently. It's very accessible with internet, social media, all of that. Unfortunately, with pornography, you are not able a lot of times to tell if it was filmed with consent or not. So a lot of times we are seeing prominent porn providers coming forward and saying, this ended up being a victim, we apologize. And so I've talked to some of my peers about how do you know that what you're watching is consensual? And I've gotten two main responses. So the two responses I've gotten most frequently is, well, you can tell by quality, or sometimes there is a Q&A afterwards. So like we've talked about, a good extent at this point is victims are under severe manipulation, and they are under immense pressure to provide for their traffickers to protect themselves and their families. So just for a minute, to put yourself in the place of the victim, if you knew that your performance was going to protect your little sister or was going to keep your child alive, do you think you could give a pretty believable performance that you wanted to do what you're doing? Yes. And also quality. So I'm sure everyone in this room by now has heard about the big sex trafficking scandal, Jeffrey Epstein. Harvard graduate, multimillionaire, hung out with presidents. You'd say that on the surface he looked pretty quality. A lot of money, a lot of prestige, a lot of power. So if people that powerful, that high up, if they are participating in the sex trade, don't you think the quality can be pretty good, whether it's exploitation or not? So just some things to think about to make sure you're watching something consensual. So sex trafficking is is not new. It has been around for decades. It did not come with the iPhone, but it has changed a dramatic bit because of the iPhone and its technology. So 70% of child victims now are being sold online because that saves time and energy for the trafficker. So I want to talk about popular platforms that sex trafficking is utilized on. And I'm going to get into specifics for a little bit, but basically what you need to know about all of these different apps is their key feature in promoting sex trafficking is the private messaging option. So I often use the example of an Instagram post. You post a photo, you can choose to comment or not, you can interact with people in the comments, and it's public. People can see it, people who follow you can see it. But if you private message someone, well, that's just between you and who you messaged, right? So if a 12-year-old girl posts a selfie, and her family's on her Instagram, her friends are on her Instagram, and you're a trafficker, are you going to message her through that comment section where everyone can see you? Or are you going to send her a little message that only she can see? You're going to send her a private message because that way you don't have to deal with anyone calling her attention to it. It is just the judgment of that 12-year-old girl who likely knows nothing about sex trafficking, who likely has no idea that you telling her she's pretty and wanting to meet her and wanting to start this relationship with her is anything but a normal relationship, a normal bond, a normal connection. So when someone messages a victim or a potential victim privately, it's a way that they can begin privately manipulating that person with no room for someone to intervene. So no one can come forward and say, did you see this? I'm worried about this. I think this is a red flag. Because it's just you and her, or it's just you and him. And so really, it becomes that much easier to manipulate someone because you're not having to work with the outside. And that's why so commonly we see traffickers trying to isolate or physically remove their victims from people they believe care about them, because those are the people that are going to speak up and say red flags and try to eliminate that person's influence over them. But if they are isolated from them, if they move away, then once again, they have no control over the victim and they're less likely to speak up in the victim's defense. So once again with private messaging, most of the times in these cases, particularly with Snapchat and WhatsApp, these messages can be deleted. So when you are potentially tracking a victim or you are in the process of exploiting that victim and your primary form of communicating with them is private messaging, in a minute you can delete it. If you believe that someone is tracking you, if you believe that someone is onto you, one click and you've erased the evidence. You have no ties to that victim, nobody can prove it, and you're free. So decades ago, sex trafficking looked a little bit more like victims walking the street, approaching your car, what we consider prostitutes. And it was right there in the public for everyone to see. No one could argue that so-and-so was on this street corner. No one could argue that a police stopped this person at this corner. But with digital social media, you can erase your trail in a minute. It is private to begin with, and it can become erased in a minute. So I want to talk specifically about a couple of things on this slide. First of all, TikTok. TikTok actually got deleted earlier this month, and it was a private messaging service, very popular when I was in middle school. If one of your friends didn't have an iPhone, you didn't want to put up with green bubbles instead of blue bubbles when you texted them. So basically how it worked was you had someone's username, and that's how you found your friends and you began conversating with them. Well, when I was in middle school, we all had this app because we all wanted to talk to our friends, we all wanted to have whatever the new messaging service was like. And I remember very vividly being at sleepovers with my friends, and we'd be having a great time, and then all of a sudden one of us would receive a message on Kik from someone we did not know. And it would usually be a man, and he would usually have sent some explicit photo and try to begin a conversation, and we had no idea. How did they find us? How did they get our username? How did they even know that we were girls? And so when I began doing research into sex trafficking and how social media can be used by traffickers, I found third-party sites attached to Kik. So this is a screenshot from a third-party site. And it might be a little blurry, but you can see the categories are broken down to dirty kit girls, local kit guys, local kit girls, categories like that. And what you can't see, this was a screenshot from my phone, is there was a map above it of the United States. And you could zoom in on your area, click one of these categories, and it would give you usernames. So although I cannot go back to 7th grade, 6th grade and say, oh, this is how they found us, this is how they found our usernames, it's very likely that it was this technology that provided traffickers and buyers with our information without us even knowing about it. The second thing I want to talk about is Backpage.com. And this is a screenshot from Backpage. Basically, if you can't see it, it looks a lot like a human Craigslist. Little image, little description, little thing to click, except instead of a lawnmower or a car, what we're seeing is Forehand Special, Every Man's Fantasy, Sexy Latinas. Because they're advertising a human instead of a product. But for traffickers, it's the same thing. So recently, the United States passed SESTA, which was the Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act, where websites like Backpage were forced to be taken down. And you saw a little bit of it in the trailer I played at the beginning. But it was because they figured out that these websites were staying up from the profit of selling victims. However, what looked like a very big victory of taking down a platform, rescuing all these victims, actually put us further behind in stopping sex trafficking. So with Backpage, law enforcement knew about it. All of these girls, all of these victims, they could be located in a second. Just start a message, start a meeting, arrange to meet, potentially rescue a victim. However, when Backpage was taken down, all of these profiles and all of the people who are represented in them are lost. They have to be found again. Because while it sounds great to take down the ways victims are being advertised and that looks like we're actually taking down their abuse, really they're just moving to other platforms. Traffickers are unfortunately very savvy with technology, a lot of times more savvy than law enforcement. So taking down one, they're just going to move to another one. They're just going to find another way to advertise. And that is the reason you see Bedpage next to Backpage. So when I started gathering information, because I update this slide pretty frequently, talking about the new apps, the new ways victims are exploited, new statistics, I decided to double check, just make sure that Backpage was really taken down. And it was taken down. But when I Googled it, the first thing I typed in was Backpage. And as Google does, it gives you suggestions. The #1 suggested search after just the word Backpage was Backpage replacement site. Because they are just going to move to the next medium. And took no time for me to find Bedpage had replaced Backpage. Just a very simple name change for the exact same services, where you can even go in, find your state, localize it, find victims. Unfortunately, I do not have a screenshot from that website. I denied that I was 18, and I can imagine it looks pretty similar as it is the exact same service with basically the same name. So, knowing the signs that a victim is or is about to be trafficked. I say take these with a grain of salt, combine them. So if you see someone has an older boyfriend, that does not mean they're being trafficked. If they have an older boyfriend, they have sexualized behavior, they have cuts, bruises, marks, that's more cause for concern. It's these in combination instead of these just isolated. So signs of physical abuse, cuts, burns, scratches, that's what we see with gorilla pimps. Obviously force being used, beatings being used to force exploitation. Truancy, falls asleep in class. So the reason with this is, in the case of a Romeo pimp, where a victim is allowed to stay at home, very common what we're seeing is, in order to blend in and make sure there's no cause for alarm, traffickers will allow their victims to go about their normal lives, where they go to school in the morning, come home, eat dinner with their family, go to bed, and then when the family is asleep, traffickers will pick up the victim, exploit them throughout the night, and bring them back in time before school starts so that nobody knows that they were gone and nobody has any reason to be alarmed. So when they get back from being sold midnight to 4 a.m. and then go to school, yes, they're going to be falling asleep in class. Yes, they're going to miss some school. And so that is a sign that victims are being trafficked because they've been sold the whole night before. Depressed, distracted, withdrawn, sexualized behavior, dressed inappropriately. These are all ways that victims are trying to cope with the trauma they are having to deal with. They're trying to take it into their control. They're trying to make it normal. So if they're being sexually exploited repeatedly, they're going to try and make that a part of their personality. They're going to try and make it feel like they are in control by changing their outfits, sexualized behavior, because they're trying to deal with the trauma and they're trying to normalize it. Tattoos on the neck, on the back, anywhere it can easily be hidden, usually a barcode or a man's name. You know how when you were a little kid and you would write your name on toys or little objects in your lunch so that you wouldn't lose them, or if you did, you would easily be able to claim it? That is the same mindset. So just like physical items and just like property of yours, traffickers will often tattoo the victims in their ring because, like we said earlier, they usually have multiple, so that they can claim ownership of that victim. So if a victim is lost or is recovered, or if there's any confusion of whose girl it is, they can very quickly say, look, that's my girl. And they will usually, if they're in the same ring, have the same tattoo. So the same man's name, the same barcode, because this is once again ownership, and this is an identifying factor to declare that as their property. Boasts of having a lot of money, older boyfriend, interacts with a new group of friends that are like gangs. So a lot of times, like we said with the Romeo pimps, they're going to offer the whirlwind romance. And that usually includes flashy gifts, flashy items, and that's where the boasts of older money have. So if you see a victim that all of a sudden has very expensive handbags, very expensive jewelry, that could easily be coming from their exploiter who just hasn't begun exploiting them yet because they are still in the wooing phase, or the grooming process as it is known. And then gang involvement. This is very similar to when we talked earlier about how traffickers want to isolate the victim from people they believe care about them. So they're going to instead offer them to hang out with a new group of people or with their friends. And they're going to be in a circle of people who see nothing wrong with what's going on, do not want you to have any alarm or say something or speak up when something's not right. They are going to condition to this victim over and over and over again that there's nothing wrong with what they're doing, that there's no one that can help them, and it's just fitting them further into the trafficker's world so the victim has no way out and cannot reach out to resources beyond them because the trafficker is going to surround them with only resources that endorse the lifestyle they want. Broken family relationships. We talked about this a little bit earlier. Anyone who's vulnerable. So that can be you're homeless, that can be you're sexually abused, or it can be internal, where you are vulnerable because you do not feel secure in your relationships, you don't feel like you have someone to rely on. And so my advice, we talk about friends and fake relationships where people are tricked into trusting someone. And so people ask me, well, how do you know who to trust? And my main advice for that is be the person that they can trust. Form a secure attachment, be the person that is going to care for them without belief that you can exploit them. Be the safe person that they can reach out to. So I want to talk a little bit about culture. First of all, we talked a little bit earlier with the video of the pimp where people are using their platforms to create misconceptions about the sex trade that make it look consensual. So I have a little image right here from SiriusXM radio, which is a great thing. The other day I was listening to the radio, and as they do in between songs, the radio host came on and began saying a few words. And she said, I think you guys are really going to like this song. It is so pimpin'. Pimping is a synonym for cool. That's why a lot of times you'll hear speakers like me and Dr. Denise and Laura Solomon ease away from the term pimp and talk more about exploiters and traffickers, because we're trying to separate it from that image of cool that has been created by radio hosts, interviewers, rappers. I'm sure a lot of you right now can think off the top of your head several rap songs where they call themselves a pimp, and it's a flex. It's something to brag about, something to look up to, and that's becoming the public image. I talk a lot about this, like I spoke earlier, with my peers, and on one occasion I was talking with a 16-year-old girl who said, I really want to talk to you about this, I want to learn more about it. And after I explained the trade and the roles within it, similar to how I've talked to you tonight, obviously it was much more condensed and less statistic-filled, She said to me, wow, I had no idea it was like that. I thought I was going to be a pimp. Because it is a totally different image that is being produced by popular culture right now. We are not seeing the abuse, we are not seeing the exploitation, we're not seeing the mental manipulation and the total domination over other human beings. We're seeing the gifts, the flashy items, the cars. Oh, Nicki Minaj called herself a pimp, so I want to be a pimp. And so that's why I talk a lot to youth groups and younger people and anyone who will listen. Thank you all for coming again. Because we have to do so much work in counteracting that culture. Because it's so prominent now that we have to reverse that. We have to be providing the image that pimps are not just money, they are abusers. Once again, this was a different girl in my math class. This is a picture I took in my math class. Some of you are familiar, sometimes in classes you play review games where on the Promethean board, similar to this, you will put up a little review and then people will go in, create usernames, and you can see everyone's progress of how they're doing on a review game. So it might be too small for you to see, but you can see here there's a list of names that people have put in as their usernames. And towards the bottom there's one where in front of the girl's name she has put Pimp. I don't want to say her actual name, so I'll say Jane. But Pimp Jane. Because once again, that is cool. That is a status symbol. The other picture in this slide is this little snippet. I don't know if you can tell, but it's actually a CD. I was taking a walk in my old neighborhood, and I came across this mysterious stack of CDs. And so, being very curious, I flipped them over and saw that they were a stack of pornography DVDs. This one was included in the stack, where it says Barely Legal Stepdaughters by Hustler Videos. So this goes more into how the sex trade adapts to its market. So like we said, victims are becoming younger and younger when they enter the sex trade because that's what's desired. Here we have people selling products. It is obviously being sold. I'm pretty sure a store didn't come and dump this in the street. This was an individual who bought it. It is a desirable product to have barely legal, underage, because that is what the market is shifting towards, and that's what we're seeing in the sex trade. So that is the end of my presentation. These are some resources I want to keep up here. These are hotlines you can call, numbers to keep in your phone or written down, where if you suspect something, you can report it. So here we have immigrant customs, because immigrants are very vulnerable. We have missing and exploited children, human trafficking hotline, and National Runaway Safe Line. And then finally, this is my Instagram. If you want to come to more of my events, if you'd like to follow my mission, if you have any questions that we don't have time for in the Q&A, would love to talk to you all about it. And then real quick, here are my references. So thank you all so much for coming tonight. I do have time for a little Q&A, and I'm going to leave this up here so everyone can take a picture of it. Does anyone have any questions? Oh, yes?
You got to use the microphone.
Oh, okay.
Because we're streaming this live.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. All right, Isabel. Okay, so in your opinion, what do you think our government and especially like our legislation system need to do in order, like the steps that they need to take in order to prevent sex trafficking?
Great question. So Dr. Nislan mentioned this a little bit earlier, but this is my predominant thing where I go around speaking to presentations and audiences, but that's not going to solve the whole issue as a whole. So right now I'm working a lot with government officials, members of the state board, to make it required for sex trafficking education like these presentations to be included in school curriculums. So many of the victims, like we established, are school-age children when they enter the trade. And schools have a very unique opportunity where a lot of times they're around students more than their own parents. And so if a parent isn't going to have the conversation about sex trafficking, which often they don't with their children, then the school needs to be the provider of that information so that a child can be equipped with the resources and the knowledge to protect themselves, to protect the people around them, and to say something when they suspect something.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Yes?
Thank you. This doesn't work. Yeah, so
No, it's on TV.
Oh, gotcha.
It's on.
So it does work. Let me just first say that you are just outstanding. I'm a faculty. I'm very impressed. But I'm also a mother. I have a 10-year-old and a 2-year-old. So some of the statistics you threw up, I mean, honestly, I almost had to get up and walk out. And I find myself tearing up as I ask you this question, because as a mom, this is extremely alarming. And I wonder if you know of anything in the community that we can take our children to get more information. Obviously, I work with Dr. Solomon, but I want my kids to be exposed as appropriately and as soon as possible, so that this doesn't happen to them and so that I don't end up in jail.
Yes. Great question. So I spoke a little bit about how I'm working with the state board, because right now there are not set programs or initiatives in the community for children to be taken to, and it is very much dependent on if a parent decides to introduce the topic or not. We mentioned how I do not just come up here and speak to adults or teenagers, I also talk to youth groups. So I've talked to kindergartners, first graders about sex trafficking, because really you can adapt the conversation depending on what you want to expose them to. So obviously you wouldn't sit down a 2-year-old and say, you might be filmed for porn. No, you would sit down and you'd say, this is how you safely use technology, which a 2-year-old, you probably don't have to worry about that yet, but I have had parents come up to me and say, my 3-year-old has an iPad, how do I know she's safe? Don't give your 3-year-old an iPad. But basically, you just need to dial it down to internet safety at a younger age, because you can start with don't accept information from people you don't know, don't talk to people you don't know. You can monitor that to a certain extent. Hey, if somebody reaches out to you that you are not familiar with, let me know. These are some alarming language you can look out for. And then as they get older, you can introduce them to, okay, here's the sex trafficking aspect of it. Here's the ways you're exploited. And so really you can introduce them to the topic younger and then let it grow as they get older. Yes? Sorry, should I song?
I should stay back there.
This says my full name.
Here you go.
Great job. So proud. My question is about, I know you have different versions of your presentation, some sanitized, to adapt to your audience. How is this accepted in school systems?
That's a great question.
Are you invited to schools to share this very important information? And one last thing, I know Florida just passed the legislation to include human trafficking education in their schools. So if you could speak to that.
Yes, I'd love to. So if any of you are familiar with me, which several of you are in this room, I have realized very quickly that schools are very uncomfortable with this topic because it's their students and they feel like they're being blamed for the exploitation, and so they don't want to address it at all, and they also don't want to deal with the wrath of parents for bringing it in. So actually at my school, I was set up to speak, and then the night before, very late at night, I got an email saying, we're going to have to cancel. And then never heard back about it. And then was told by other teachers that they were told I was working on something else. So basically the reasons that happened was, one, they were afraid of outlash by parents because they were concerned that a student would come home, tell their parent about it, and then the parent would say, why did my 6th grader just ask me what pornography was? And so the second reason is it's very scary, and they wanted it sanitized. I am a high schooler. We established that. You may have known that when I walked in the room. I can guarantee you, no matter where your child goes to school, we know what sex is. We know the forms of exploitation. We know what that looks like. We do not know what sex trafficking is. We do not know how vulnerable each of us are and by which reasons we are to all of these little nuances in social media, little relationships that we might be led to trust. We don't know how to protect ourselves against it. So schools are very touchy about the topic. Some are more supportive than others. I have had boards of education reach out to me. I have had some people in Columbia County reach out to me. It's growing, thankfully. With Florida passing the legislation, that is a huge step forward. Like I spoke about earlier, students, they are spending a great deal of their time at school, and that's where we're getting education on cyberbullying, on drugs. Sex trafficking is just as prevalent and just as relevant to their students as those issues, and so we need to address it in a similar format. It needs to be woven into curriculum, and it needs to be addressed in a similar manner to those. So that's why I'm so grateful for all of y'all coming out today, for being willing to have the conversation, not shying away from it. Thank you. Oh, yes? Question? I believe they're passing you the mic.
Thank you. I'm sorry. I'm a CASA volunteer, and I deal a lot with foster children. And dealing with foster children, you deal with adults and you deal with parents. And from my experience, I found that a lot of parents, they kind of like put a blind eye of what's going on. Like I have one where the child has a phone, but the parent never, really reviewed, what's going on with the phone. I don't want to invade her privacy. And that shocked me. I'm like, you're the parent, she's the child. You're paying the bill. She has no privacy, So how could we kind of customize what you're doing to kind of wake up the adults, with the so-called privacy issue, to let them know, like you said, you have to train your child. And if you're going to shun away from it, we're never going to resolve the issue.
Yes, exactly. So that's a great question.
Sorry.
I very much value my privacy. I am 18, so it's a little different, but I very much value my privacy, and obviously it depends on the age of the children. So in the case of a 3-year-old with an iPad, obviously you should know what's going on with that. When you get to the teenage years, you can be a little more distant on that and let them use their own judgment. The key, I always say, like the websites, it is not going to solve sex trafficking or take away the risk by taking away the technology or taking down the websites. What's going to eliminate the risk is having the education and the awareness to use it safely. So that's why I don't say go through your child's phone or take away all their privacy. Instead, show them how to use it safely, give them the guidelines to use it safely, tell them the red flags, tell them the green flags. Basic internet safety habits is what you need to instill. And you can introduce sex trafficking or not. You can say, watch out for this. You can, again, it depends very much on the age of the child. But if you're going to give your child a smartphone, make sure that they know how to use it safely instead of just hovering. Because like we said before, that's not going to solve. Yes. Thank you. Oh, yes, ma'am.
Since you said you have a hard time getting into the schools, have you tried approaching the PTAs and having it delivered to the PTA, to the parents first, and then having them back you to show it in the school auditorium?
I have not. That is a great suggestion. I'm going to take that in. Right now, I'm working more with state board members, I don't want to say a little above the school, but a little above specific schools, and so I will definitely be trying to continue getting into schools as well. And then I speak to peers at groups other than schools. We mentioned youth groups or in classrooms. I talk with my peers about it a lot. Actually, I had a teacher recently let me use his class to talk about sex trafficking and present this presentation, a shortened version. So we are adapting to the means, but I am very happy to present to PTOs. That was a great idea. Thank you. Oh, yes. Thank you for running.
So what can we do as college students to help fight back against the sex trafficking?
That's a great question. So just having the conversation really is going to do so much help. It's why I do what I do, just introducing the conversation to as many platforms as you can, whether it's having a conversation with your friend or speaking at your religious organization or talking with your family about it. The more people you talk to about it, then they are more able to talk about it, and it's spreading the message, spreading the awareness, because so much of this issue is rooted in just ignorance of the topic. And so when you lessen that ignorance and you lessen the stigma surrounding it, because once again, we've manipulated sex trafficking in modern culture to be very praising of the pimp and very dismissive of the victim. Once you talk about the realities of sex trafficking, the actual dimensions of it and the actual facets that are involved in it, then you can combat the misunderstanding and start having healthy discussions that allow more potential victims to be spared and more people to be active in fighting it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. Thank you so much.
Laura Graves come up and have something to say.
Isabelle, first of all, happy birthday.
Thank you.
The donation for your future nonprofit, and also want to be big family.
Thank you so much.
One last thing. This was streamed live on YouTube tonight. The Department of Communication calls our TV professor, Dr. Louis Antunes, who's over here, and his team, Chris Frank back here, and Christina, and several others. Yes, I really appreciate their help, and if you want to watch it, it will be archived, correct? So go to Facebook and just put Augusta University and Department of Communication in your question mark, and it'll be right at the top. There'll be a link to the YouTube page. Isabelle, outstanding job.
Absolutely.
I hope you public speaking students realize how great a public speaker you just heard. Thank you. Have a great evening, great rest of the semester. Be careful out there. It's still raining.